Joining us from Paris now is veteran Brazilian journalist Pepe Escobar. Pepe, it's really a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Enormous pleasure to be with you, Joe, and with all of you.
Okay. So listen, Pepe, I know you've just returned from Italy, but before we talk about the situation there, I'd like to go over a little bit about Brazil. Since you are Brazilian, you've been following Brazilian politics carefully for a long time. And could you explain to us, to the audience, some of the basics? Because this has not made a lot of news in the corporate media in the U.S. What has been going on there? Just what was the car wash investigation? What was Lula's role in that? And what is the scandal that The Intercept has revealed recently? And what do you know about that is not known, particularly about rumblings about Russian involvement now?
Exactly. They are trying to turn it into a Russia gate, in fact. It's an extremely complex story. It's one of the most important stories of the early 21st century, because at the center of Brazil Gate at the moment, which the Bolsonaro government wants to turn into a Russia gate, following the master straight from his master's voice. Brazil is a pawn in the big conflict, geopolitical conflict of the 21st century, which is the US against the Russia-China strategic partnership. We should never forget that Brazil is part of the BRICS. And when Lula was president in the previous decade, virtually every important decision in terms of expanding the reach and depth and influence of BRICS was because of Lula. He was extremely well regarded by Moscow and Beijing. At the time, we all remember, it was Hu Jintao in Beijing, and Putin was prime minister for many of those years, and Medvedev was president. And Lula was admired, revered, considered, and he was absolutely instrumental into many key decisions of the BRICS, including this drive towards the multipolar world based on bypassing the US dollar, on closer relations between BRICS countries, the founding of the BRICS Bank, which happened in 2014, like two days after the end of the World Cup at the time, that Brazil lost ignominiously. Remember? So this was when Dilma Rousseff was president. So BRICS, Brazil, Russia, China, in terms of the Beltway, it was always a very dirty word and very dirty concept, and it still is. So during the Obama administration, essentially, what the deep state was aiming at is we need to try to break up this relationship. It was pointless trying to do something with India, because India, the Indian establishment is totally westernized, is Anglophiliac, in fact, is pro-American essentially. They have, as much as I love India, please don't misunderstand me, but their elites, they have a tremendous inferiority complex vis-a-vis the white man. There is some white man's burden subplot is still going on in India, and they still don't know how to relate to their colonial past. And they have a subcolonial mentality, many of their elites, in fact, including parts of academia, think tanks, etc. So it was identified by the deep state as early as 2010. And we learned all this via WikiLeaks, of course, once again. Great work by Julian and everybody at WikiLeaks. That the NSA started spying on Petrobras, the Brazilian oil giant especially, and the Dilma government, essentially, including Dilma's smartphones, cell phones, you name it. And suddenly, this NSA collected dossier falls into the lap of a State Department asset, Judge Mora, which is from a southern state in Brazil. He had been to the US before. He was a big fan of the Mani Puliti operation in Italy, which he didn't exactly understand how it worked, in fact. In fact, many Italian judges of the Mani Puliti Later on, they were saying, look, we saw that they were doing something for the benefit of Italy. In the end, we dismantled the political system. And what emerged afterwards? Berlusconi. So in Brazil, it's something much worse than Berlusconi that emerged, is Bolsonaro. There is an Italian connection, in fact. The family is from a small town in the Veneto, in fact. It's not mafia from Calabria or Sicily in the south, but it's a sort of clannish kind of association from the Veneto. There are a lot of Veneto immigration, especially in São Paulo, which is a big Italian city, just like New York City or Buenos Aires. São Paulo is a big Italian city outside of Italy. So 2010 to 2014, it was the first part of, I define it as a rolling coup. And some of the best Brazilian analysts in academia also, they more or less tend to go along these lines. It was a slow moving coup that started with collecting data, which was the NSA role. The dossier lands with a minor judge in a lesser state in Brazil, not in the centers of power, and the center of economic power, especially São Paulo. They start what they call the car wash investigation, which is a carbon copy of the money politi operation in Italy.
Clean hands.
I'm sorry?
Hands. Monopoliti, clean hands.
Clean hands, oh yeah, of course. And this slowly evolved into, I would say, a three-stage second part of the coup, which was, the first part was very easy to achieve. Basically impeach Dilma Rousseff on absolutely spurious charges. This happened in 2016. Dilma had been re-elected in 2014, and the campaign to destabilize the Dilma II government had already started even before she was re-elected at the end of 2014. So this went on for 2 years. Car wash was progressing, of course, in terms of plea bargains left and right, and basically centered on Petrobras, the oil giant, but also the Brazilian construction companies, which are, let's say, national champions in terms of Brazilian industry. These are among the largest civil engineering construction companies in the world, with lots of business in South America and in Africa especially, and parts of the Middle East as well. So the first part of the coup concluded in 2016 with the impeachment of Dilma. And the second part, which was the Holy Grail, tried to prevent Lula from running in the 2018 elections, which everyone in Brazil knew that he would win. And even the latest polls before he was actually prevented, once again, spurious charges from running in 2018, he would be elected in the first round, in fact. So this was achieved, I would say, in terms of international relations and a political economy, this should be the case history to be studied in the best universities in the world from now on. How do you organize a hybrid war mixed with a rolling coup involving Congress, the judiciary, Brazilian Supreme Court, prosecutors from many Brazilian states, and mainstream media, considering that mainstream media in Brazil is as concentrated as in the US, for instance. Basically in Brazil, it's 5 or 6 families that control 90% of Brazilian media. I know some of these very disgusting characters from the inside because I used to write for the newspapers 30-something years ago. So so from 2016 to 2018, we had this machine, congressional, judicial, mediatic, business, etc., trying to frame Lula on any charge. And the only charge that Car Wash found was a very dubious charge about an apartment that Lula might have received from one of the construction companies to facilitate some contracts with Petrobras. This was never conclusively proved. And I'm sure this is something that you will never read in the New York Times and the Washington Post. As far as I could follow the American coverage, when it comes to BRICS and when it came to car wash involving a coup d'etat, in fact, a slow motion coup d'etat in Brazil with Lula, I followed how the Americans were covering because the NSA was the origin of all that. And any well-informed Brazilian knows that, but certainly not the majority of the population because they don't have access to independent, critically independent media in Brazil. They are more or less brainwashed by the global network empire, which would be a mix of CBS, ABC, NBC, and CNN all together with a telenovela heavy angle behind it. So most Brazilians, lower middle class or the working classes, they watch Global and they get politics from what Global is telling them, which is, of course, the Brazilian establishment and the Brazilian comprador elite's view of Brazil. So what happened to Lula last year before the election was absolutely critical because only a few months before the elections that everybody knew he was going to win, he was sent to jail. This was obviously reported all over the world. And nowadays we know that along with Julian Assange, Lula is the most important political prisoner on the planet. It's Lula and Julian Assange. And it's exactly the same fight. The difference is, while Lula was president, the deep state could not go against him because he was internationally respected, even by Obama, as the guy. After government is different. And with Dilma, which was not as much of an expert as Lula was in terms of political articulation and not only internationally. Lula internationally was revered by everybody. And nationally, nobody could go against him because he was a master articulator. When you saw Lula in a room discussing with different political leaders, it was an absolute joy to watch. No wonder professional politicians were in awe because nobody had that kind of power and charisma and information. And this is a guy that was practically semi-illiterate. He didn't even finish primary school, to give you an idea. And he could discuss with Hu Jintao or Lavrov or anybody all over the Bush Jr. loved Lula for some crazy reason, you know. People in Wall Street loved Lula because, you know, he speaks his mind. You know, it's great to do business with him. And obviously for Wall Street, it was not a bad deal because they made a lot of money, especially hot money in Brazil when Lula was president, when Dilma was president as well, and now even more with Bolsonaro. Anyway, so last year we reached, let's say, the conclusion of 90% of the coup, which was Dilma impeached, Lula in jail, and finally, because the plan A, which was to have a social democrat as president of Brazil, somebody who belongs to the Cardoso, Clinton, Tony Blair neoliberal gang. And don't forget that Cardoso and Clinton are very, very close and always been. The problem is their candidate was polling around 4 or 5% before the elections. He would never be elected. So the Brazilian elites and everybody that was behind the rolling coup, the hybrid war coup, they identified, oh, our plan B is this guy, Bolsonaro. He's supported by the military. It didn't matter that he was a mediocre parliamentarian, which in 27 years in Congress, he entered 2 bills, which is something completely crazy now. But he had the confidence of the military because they thought that they could manipulate him. Big mistake. All right, we're going to talk about this later. Because nowadays, he is trying to manipulate the military, even though our current vice president is a 4-star general. And now there's a conflict between the Bolsonaro gang and the military. So, but this is later in our conversation. To wrap up our first question, the thing is, nowadays, not only the NSA and the US deep state accomplished the utmost objective, which is to isolate Brazil from BRICS. And if you see what happened at the latest BRICS meeting, the most important meeting was Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi. They had a RIC meeting. And they had a pro forma BRICS meeting, proving once again that Brazil had, at the moment, is completely isolated. And this is the view from Moscow and Beijing at the moment. BRICS at the moment doesn't exist. It's RIC. If we need to convert someone to the future of Eurasian integration, is Modi. And at the moment, Brazil, with Bolsonaro, is a Trumpian neocolonial entity. And that's what Brazil is nowadays. And in fact, the latest information that ties up with all this, it came out only a few days ago. Bolsonaro wants to have one of his sons as the Brazilian ambassador in US. Do you know his qualifications, Joe? He fried hamburgers in Maine once.
Well,
and I'm not making this up. So this gives us an idea of how this mini soprano gang took over. They destroyed Brazilian foreign policy in 6 months, which is quite an achievement, because Brazil always had an excellent diplomatic corps, one of the best in the world, internationally recognized at the Itamaraty in Brasilia. They are destroying the environment with a minister of environment who's basically a guy planted by the agribusiness lobby. They are destroying education with a minister of education, which is anti-education. And this is even the best political scientists and the best of Brazilian academia. People are so puzzled that, you know, some analyses are starting to emerge, but people are still puzzled. How could that happen and so fast? Considering that it was dismissed that Brazilian democracy was very solid. It's, after all, it's a less than 30-year-old democracy. So it was not that solid, and it was very easy to dismantle it from the inside. So it was a combination of the American initial impulse, American connections, and the Brazilian comprador elite. So in only 2 years, you dismantle everything that happened with the Lula and Dilma government. The regression is equivalent to throwing Brazil back to the 19th century, in fact, and I'm not exaggerating. In fact, the new, the way these controlling elites view the emergence of the new middle class in Brazil and the working classes that are part of the system, because they are stakeholders as well, they are consumers, and before they were totally excluded. Because of the slavery heritage of Brazil, they want to, all these conquests for the past 15 years, they have to be erased. So the country has to be thrown into a position that it was in the 60s, when there was the original military coup in 1964, which was to prevent what the president at the time was trying to do, what Lula managed to do 30-something years later. And this is what these people who, they run the agribusiness, the families who control the media, including the global empire, the old landed aristocracy, especially in parts of Brazil in the northeast and the central part of Brazil, the agribusiness lobby, and obviously the evangelicals. Brazil now is a neo colony. They accomplished everything that they wanted since 2010. But the thing is, what happens next, considering that now we have a new scandal that, thanks to the Intercept, is now, nobody knows exactly where this hack came from. And in fact, it was not a hack, once again. And that's the similarity between Brazilgate and Russiagate. This was a leak, but nobody knows who actually leaked it. It could have even been from inside car wash. That's one possibility. The other possibility was a war of clans among prosecutors involved with car wash. And the third possibility, which is the most sinister of them all, is this was a rearranging of the chessboard that the Americans imposed, in fact. And this is very possible because, as far as we know, for now, Judge Moro is more or less arranging his way out of the picture. He knows that he will never be able to become the next president of Brazil, which is what he had in mind. So he went to Washington 2 weeks ago. He talked to the FBI. He talked to the CIA. So we are examining or interpreting as a sort of, okay, he's going to get his golden parachute, transferring his family to the US, children in American universities. He's going to go around American universities talking about the justice experiment he lived in Brazil, and that's it.
Pepe, let's back up a minute. Sergio Mora was the judge in the Lula case.
Yes.
And he's now become the justice minister under Bolsonaro. And
yes.
Some of his most right-wing backers are even they are turning against him now. But tell us exactly what The Intercept found out and about his role in the corruption and the scandal involving the prosecution and conviction of Lula.
Absolutely. What these leaks reveal is something that we all knew for the past 2 years, but we didn't have a smoking gun. And the smoking gun is basically the telegram intercepts, literally, between Moro as the judge conducting this investigation and the main prosecutor of car wash, a guy called Delagnol. And we see clearly by their communications that Moro was leading the investigation, which is, this in the US would be, it's ground zero of illegality, in fact. So he was the judge, the jury, the executioner, and the conductor of the whole policy, which is something absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? And of course, mainstream media was reproducing everything without a single degree of criticism. The only criticism that you read would be at the, by the way, first class in international terms, Brazilian blogosphere and independent media on the net, which they were detailing this from the beginning, but once again, they didn't have a smoking gun. So now that we have the smoking gun, because this is Brazil, nothing absolutely happened. Everybody was waiting, okay, now that Moro has been unmasked and the top prosecutor of car wash has been unmasked, things are going to start over. No way. The same thing. So Moro is saying, I'm not leaving. This guy, Delagnol, is also saying, oh no, they could have been easily manipulated, this telegram communications, and this is probably part of a Russian plot. And that's where Russiagate comes in. Because now the official version by the Bolsonaro and the extreme right camp, and also the Brazilian Federal Police, which is subordinated to Moro as Minister of Justice, is that this was a Russian plot involving Telegram and also with the participation of WikiLeaks. So it gets crazier by the day, in fact. And obviously, once again, with the cases with Dilma and Lula, this is just innuendo. There's no smoking gun anywhere. Telegram, Telegram, in fact, actually indirectly responded to all this, saying, look, this is absolutely ridiculous. We were never hacked by anybody. If anything happens, it was it was an interference inside Brazil by somebody. It was not in our system.
Excuse me, Pepe, Telegram is like WhatsApp, is that right?
Telegram is like WhatsApp. It was founded in Russia, but in fact, they are anti-Kremlin. Pavel Durov, one of the brothers who founded Telegram, he lives in Dubai nowadays in exile. In fact, I was trying to get them to talk to us about these accusations. And we received a communication by Telegram saying, look, we have absolutely nothing to do with this. We're not even in Russia. And it's true. They're not even a Russian company anymore. They're based in Germany. So, but in terms of the Brazilian Federal Police and the military who are supporting this theory, the key point is to try to find a Russiagate angle, because this is exactly what they have been told by his master's voice. Essential part of his master's voice is to create a rift between Russia and China and Brazil. It can be Russia against Brazil. It can be China against Brazil. China against Brazil is impossible because Brazil is number one. China is number one trade partner in Brazil, and they buy loads of stuff, especially in agribusiness, especially soya beans. So obviously you cannot create a problem with China. And even the Brazilian generals, one of the vice presidents, for instance, went to China, and he met Xi Jinping, and obviously he had to be extremely diplomatic. But with Russia is different because the relations between Brazil and Russia, they are not as close in trade terms as Brazil-China. So this is the perfect scapegoat for the extreme right in Brazil and for the Brazilian military. We call them the Haiti generation, because these were the guys who were at the top when Brazil was leading the UN mission in Haiti. I'm sure many of you will remember that period. So these guys are really hardcore. They pose as nationalists, as sovereigntists, in fact. But these people are, in fact, military comprador elites. And the best way to see the way they think, if you go to their official website, it's called defesa.net, defense.net in Portuguese. It's a carbon copy of the Naval War College in the US. And they use the concept of hybrid war upside down, blaming Russia for hybrid war. And we all know the hybrid war is an American think tank invented concept. We all know that. But sometimes they even translated some of my articles upside down. It's very, very funny. One of my readers told me, look, they are reading you the military are reading your stuff, but I'm not sure they understand because everything that you say, they turn it upside down in terms of hybrid war. So it's a very complex a picture because we have so many interlocked interests that were together into organizing the coup, making it happen, making sure that the left in Brazil as a whole is criminalized, not only the Workers' Party, but the left in Brazil. So everyone in Brazil there is a leftist, whatever the political party you are affiliated to, LGBT, indigenous populations, most of academia, and media, 90% of the media, you are a communist. So it's still Cold War mentality. It's very unrefined. In the US, these things can be more coded and more sophisticated. In Brazil, it's quite raw, in fact. So it's a demonization of every progressive sector of Brazilian society. Starting with university. University in Brazil is being criminalized by these people, including the current Minister of Education. So they accomplished the coup. So, but the second, let's say the epilogue of the coup is not defined yet, because they need to find a guilty party for this intercept leaks. They have to blame somebody. They're trying very hard to find somebody who's linked to Russia or to WikiLeaks or both. And they have to solve a key problem, which is how long Bolsonaro is going to stay in power. And there is a rift between the Bolsonaro clan and the military. The military would like to govern by themselves. In fact, they are already governing, let's say, by 60 or 70%, because the Brazilian equivalent of the National Security Council in the US, which they call the Cabinet of Institutional Security. It's all Brazilian generals and with the same profile, the Haiti generation, and they pose as nationalists, but in fact they want China out, Russia out, and US in, which is obviously, as comprador military elites, they are following the orders from his master's voice.
His master's voice being in Washington, D.C.
Being Washington, D.C. and the Beltway as a whole.
Pepe, we're speaking with Pepe Escobar from Paris. Pepe is a veteran Brazilian journalist. He's also a contributor to Consortium News. And Elizabeth Voss, my co-host, has a question for you, Pepe.
Absolutely.
I love the comparison you've made between Russiagate and this car wash scandal. And I was wondering if you think that the outcome overall going forward will be similar in terms of car wash to what we've seen with Russiagate, which is to say that we've seen Russiagate just continue to lumber on despite being debunked on multiple aspects of the scandal, whether it's hacking, collusion, etc. So do you think, unfortunately, that despite being factually kind of exposed, that car wash is just going to continue on regardless?
Well, car wash as an investigation mechanism, process, rolling coup, whatever you want to call it, is dead by now. The problem is the guy who conducted car wash is the Minister of Justice. So he can resurrect car wash on any vector he wants, as long as he's in power. And the number one prosecutor, he continues to tour around Brazil, giving speeches here and there. You know, it's like nothing happened. Their number one preoccupation at the moment is to find a culprit. After they find a culprit, we're going to see where this is going to lead. And obviously, this would, for anything to really change, something would have to change at the very top, which means the Brazilian Supreme Court. They are in a recess at the moment. They'll be back in August. And they're going to judge one of, I would say, thousands of appeals of Lula's defense, which they're now arguing. Considering what we all know now about car wash, everything was illegal, including the imprisonment of Lula. So the whole story has to be declared null and void. We know this is not going to happen because from the Supreme Court judges, we can say for sure that at least 4 of them are completely bought by the ruling comprador elite. And that will leave only 2, a minority of 2. So it's impossible at the moment to overturn everything that happened in the rolling hybrid war coup. But the pressure from civil society will be essential. But the problem is, civil society, when you talk about civil society nowadays, it does not include mainstream media, and it does not include major Brazilian business. They are still betting on Bolsonaro privatizing everything in Brazil, number one, basically selling Brazil out, which is exactly what his master's voice, deep state, Beltway want. To the benefit, especially of American companies, like selling Embraer to Boeing. That's the number one example at the moment. And privatizing parts of the pre-salt deposits, which is trillions of dollars of unexplored oil, basically to ExxonMobil, Chevron, and not to Gazprom or to Chinese companies, you know. So we are in the early stage of the epilogue, let's put it this way. So it could become a rolling mix of Russiagate and total chaos. At the moment, we are in a total chaos stage because in 6 months, they managed to destroy basically all the progressive institutions in Brazilian society that were organized with a lot of struggle for the past 15 to 20 years. They destroyed the economy. They destroyed Brazilian industry. Brazil was, before the coup against Dilma, was on the way to become the 5th largest economy in the world. Now it's the 8th and probably is going to run to 10th and keep dropping. You know, they isolated Brazil politically, especially from Europe and obviously from Russia and China. The only ally that Brazil has is the Trump administration, which nowadays doesn't count for much, right? So it's an extremely complex, still an extremely complex, unresolved story. And it all depends, I would say the number one factor is what the Brazilian military are going to do next. And nobody knows for sure because there is an internal struggle between a wing that we can call really nationalist and sovereign, let's put it this way, and the majority which poses as nationalists, but they are in fact subordinated to Washington's interests. So depending on this internal struggle and how they're going to get rid of Bolsonaro via probably a white coup, which could happen in the next few weeks, months, or 1 or 2 years, because everybody's going to see that the economy in Brazil is still imploding, and they need to get rid of him and his Minister of Finance, then we're going to have a better perspective of what could happen before the next Brazilian elections, because progressives in Brazil are basically praying for the next election so they can get rid of Bolsonaro. But we could have a Trump 2 effect in Brazil as well. He could even be reelected if mainstream media and big businesses behind them. It's very hard to go against him if they control the narrative. The thing is that they are controlling the narrative, but barely. After this scandal, the Intercept scandal broke out, they lost control of the narrative, and they are trying to rearrange themselves. So this proves that our main thesis, which is the Americans wanted to rejig the chessboard, it's what's really going on. Because for the Trump administration, Brazil was more or less case closed. We won. They are in our pockets, which is exactly what happened when Bolsonaro was elected. The problem is his administration is such a disaster that even business in the US are starting to complain to Trump directly. And we got this from some of our good Washington and New York sources that, look, it's not good to do business in Brazil anymore. We saw that we'll go there and buy everything and nothing is happening. So you see, there's so many superimposed layers in the story, and that's what makes it so fascinating from a journalistic point of view, of course, and from the point of view of this bigger confrontation, which is Brazil as a pawn. We have the Trump administration, the deep state on one side, and on Brazil, they are in agreement. This is very important, unlike the civil war in Washington, against Russia and China on the other side, because Brazil is part of the BRICS.
Pepe,
yes,
you've just returned from Italy, and there's a bit about Russia going on there as well now. Tell us about it.
But this is fascinating, Joe, because it's fascinating because the time I was in it, I was in Milano, Torino, and Genova, which are a mix of, they are 3 business centers in different areas, and finance, industry, ports, etc. The talk in Genova is the Chinese are coming. They're going to buy a stake in the new port, which is in the outskirts of if you've been to Geneva, you know, there's the small port right in front of the old downtown, and a gigantic port in the outskirts, which is going to be one of the terminals of the new Silk Roads. Mm-hmm. Very important. We're going to have Trieste, we're going to have Geneva, and we're going to have Venice as well. The Chinese are betting on these 3 Italian ports because they figured out that only having Piraeus in Greece is not enough. So they are building a sort of, let's say, a non-hostile string of pearls connection from the South China Sea, Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and Southern Europe for global supply chains and the interconnection between the new Silk Roads in Asia with Europe. And Italy has joined the new Silk Roads, the Belt and Road Initiative. This was sealed 3 months ago when Xi Jinping visited Italy. And obviously there's the northern part, which includes the new Silk Roads arriving in Hamburg and Rotterdam, in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, essentially. So the Chinese are advancing in Europe via Northern Europe and via the Mediterranean as well. So this was the big talk in Genova. The problem is Salvini, number 2 in government. He's the deputy prime minister, minister of interior and deputy prime minister. He has an enormous problem with China. He's very close to Russia. And as close as a scandal that broke out a few days ago of Russian financing of his campaign. And this is a very, very murky story. Still beginning, right? So we have the 5-star people who are pro-China and Salvini and the Lega people who are pro-Russia. So there is an internal, the internal dynamics of the Italian government at the moment. There's a clash of interests because Salvini is very close to Steve Bannon, and we all know what that means. China is going to destroy us all, right? So this is very interesting. When you go to Milan, the talk is about everybody wants to invest in Italy, not Europeans, of course. Russians and Chinese. They are, Milano is going to be a hub in terms of finance, in terms of exporting made in Italy to China and also to Russia as well. And Russians are going to invest in Northern Italian companies, and many of them based in Milan. So it's interesting because you see Russia and China being embraced in Italy in a way that you will never see here in France, where I am, for instance, where both are seen with extreme diffidence by the French establishment, which obviously Macron wants to turn France into a startup. So what Macron has in mind for France is a very American process, which will never work in France. France is very centralized, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Okay, it still applies in many senses. They don't want privatization of the railways. They don't want privatization of the post office in France, for instance. And these are all priorities for Macron. Italy, and of course, on top of all this, we have the banking crisis in Europe. We have most Italian banks, they are completely dead. They are, I would say they are 1 millimeter away from bankruptcy. And now we have, which was something that exploded last week, the fact that Deutsche Bank now, everybody knows that Deutsche Bank is on the way to bankruptcy. And they transfer some of their best assets from Germany to BNP Paribas here in France, because they are connected. So if Deutsche Bank collapses, BNP Paribas is going to collapse in France, and the major Italian banks are going to collapse as well. So this is what they are not discussing in Brussels at the moment, because they were very busy trying to get a new leader of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, which is Merkel protege. Instead of discussing the imminent financial crisis that could disrupt everything in the European Union. So this is a short window of hell awaiting us here in Europe, Joe.
Well, Pepe, this was a brilliant tour de force of yours to bring us from Brazil to Italy to China to Russia. Speaking of the BRICS.
Oh, God.
And we want to thank you for joining us from Paris.
Thank you.
On CN Live. And we hope you come back and talk to us again and update us in a week or two. How's that, Pepe?
Absolutely. Look, I'll be in Asia. So the next one will be from Asia, and we can talk a lot about China and what China is doing all over Asia.
That would be terrific. Thank you again, Pepe Escobar from Paris.
Enormous pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and we will be back in a moment.